Today we're going to talk about deceit and deception and cheating in the animal world. And I want to start with this notion of altruism. Altruism just means doing something for another individual at your own expense. So altruist, someone that does a good deed. And in biology, we think that altruism is not an adaptive trait. And if you think about it, evolution works at the level of individuals. And if you do something to benefit another individual, to help them survive or help them reproduce at the cost of your own survival or reproduction, then over the course of time, your altruistic genes are not going to be replaced. So it becomes very difficult to understand how altruistic behavior could be maintained in a population. What I want to start with is a tale about the common raven. And this work was actually done here in Maine over near Mount Blue, over near Farmington. It was done by a biologist at the University of Vermont, Bernd Heinrich, who has a cottage at the base of Mount Blue. Ravens are birds that live in Maine year-round, and during the wintertime, they depend largely on carcasses. And Heinrich was out walking around on his property and he found a dead moose. This dead moose, of course, represented a huge amount of food. And he found that a raven discovered that moose about the same time that he did. What that raven did was to fly up in the air and in ever-increasing circles, calling vigorously. And what it did was to attract lots of other ravens to come to the party. So before Heinrich was amazed, before he knew it, there were 50 to 100 ravens that are all around the moose carcass taking advantage of the food. To Heinrich, this seemed like an altruistic behavior. Why would a raven that had found enough food to get it through the winter, why would a raven call in other individuals of its species to partake of the food? This was a project that he spent years working on, and just to cut to the chase, he really didn't solve the problem until he started capturing birds and putting tags on them so he could tell individuals apart. Turns out that male and female ravens mate for life, and that couple will maintain a very large territory, and they defend it against all other ravens. So it turned out the bird that discovered that moose carcass was not one of the resident pair, but instead was a juvenile that was unmated, and that juvenile knew that if it tried to take advantage of that moose carcass for the course of the winter, that sooner or later the resident pair would find it and they would run that juvenile off. So what the juvenile did was to call in its conspecifics, and essentially they overwhelmed the resident pair. So the residents, they were attracted by the calls as well, and they're trying to keep these 100 young ravens away from the moose carcass, and of course that was a futile effort. So it turned out not to be an altruistic act at all that the original discoverer did to call in its friends, but rather it was selfish behavior, because the only way it was going to get a significant amount of moose was to overwhelm the resident pair. So what seemed like altruistic behavior was, in fact, selfish behavior. And as we will see, behaviors often are very subtle, they're often very surprising, but we're going to take a look at a number of different behaviors today that rely on trickery or deception. So let's start with the mantis shrimp, beautiful crustaceans that are found mostly in tropical waters. And they live in burrows, but they need to come out of the burrow to feed. They feed on fish and other crustaceans, so they're predatory. But like all crustaceans, mantis shrimp have to molt. And when they molt, they, of course, have a soft shell until they can harden it up. So they're susceptible to being eaten themselves. And what a mantis shrimp will do, particularly when it is molting, is it will stick its head just outside of its burrow and expand its claws, making itself look huge. And what it's doing is trying to scare other would-be predators off by making it appear larger than it really is. But in fact, it would be a nice meal for a fish if it knew to try to grab that mantis shrimp that was in the process of molting. So here's a mantis shrimp in its burrow, and if a fish came by, what it would do would be to expand those claws out, extend them left and right to make it look like it was a really large organism. We're going to talk about dishonest signaling here in these insects that are called fig wasp. They are found, as the name suggests, burrowing in figs. They're not pollinating wasps, unlike the ones that we saw in the video last week. But it turns out there are two morphs, or two phenotypes of male wasp. One of them is about 20% larger than the other. Now, these male wasps fight with each other all the time to gain access to females and also to gain access to food. And they fight by wrestling with their jaws, their mandibles. It turns out that these this large morph, they have, of course, larger mandibles just because they are bigger, but they are even larger than they would seem. They're disproportionately larger. So what happens is when a large male is approached by a smaller male, the smaller male is usually going to give up without even fighting at all. So the larger males get the advantage of not having to fight as often, and as a result, they get more matings with females. Well, as it turns out, it's all a ruse, because in fact, the large mandibles are weaker than the mandibles of the small ones. So it's a dishonest signal because the small males are giving up when they didn't really have to. But the large males are more than happy to take advantage of the fact that the smaller males are afraid of them. So that would be a case of a dishonest signal. Fiddler crabs use their asymmetrical claws to signal each other. The males are the ones that have the asymmetrical claws. And the claws are often lost. And when a claw is lost, it has to be, of course, regenerated. So up above, you see a regenerated claw. Down below is an original claw. And it's the same sort of process that goes on here as went on with the fig wasp, which is that the regenerated claw is in fact weaker. So when males are fighting other males, the regenerated claw is actually a less effective weapon. But because it looks large, other males might in fact be afraid to attack a particular male. So here's a case of deception again, where the crab essentially behaves as if it has a perfectly functional, really powerful claw, when in fact it's only a shadow of the original one that it had. I'm going to go into YouTube for a second here, and we're going to look at a little chemical deception. What we're going to hear about in this video, which pertains to a spider, is the term pheromone. It's P-H-E-R-O-M-O-N-E. And a pheromone is a chemical that one organism puts out to attract members of the opposite sex. So we'll watch this short video on the bola spider.
Another champion in the realm of chemical deception is the bola spider. She takes a proactive approach to catching prey, dangling a silken thread from her outstretched leg, like a medieval flail or a bolus. The head of her weapon, in lieu of a lead ball, is a blob of sticky thread. To lure a male moth into range, the bola spider cleverly mimics the smell or pheromones of a female moth. Swooning into range, the male is struck with the bolus. The spider reels in its prey and delivers a deadly bite.
We'll go now to gray squirrels. Gray squirrels hoard food. They will find acorns and other seeds, and they will hoard them for use later. Now, some kinds of hoarding animals are said to be larder hoarders. That is, they store all of their food in a single place or a single larder. But gray squirrels are different. They're what we call scatter hoarders. So they will take food and they will scatter it all around, and their memories are pretty good. But it turns out that squirrels are pretty clever, and they will follow the paths of other squirrels and see where they cache their food, and then come and steal the food from the original hoarder. It also is done by blue jays and some other birds as well. So in gray squirrels, there's an interesting behavior that they engage in, and that is that if other squirrels or blue jays are around watching them, what they do is they pretend to hoard seeds. So the squirrel will cache food in some of the holes, but many of them would be empty. And the idea is that a marauder would try to find a cached nut and would keep finding a hole in the ground with no food, and so would eventually give up. So that's an interesting behavior. It turns out that some students in an animal behavior class at Central Connecticut State University were studying this particular phenomenon, and what they decided to do was to go and be marauders themselves. So on the campus there in Connecticut, they would remove the nuts that were cached by squirrels. And what the squirrels did was to increase their anti-pilfering technique. They would hide their nuts in places that were very hard for humans to get, and they would try to make more fake caches than they had previously. We'll talk a little bit about breeding in birds. In songbirds particularly, we're going to be looking at 3 species of songbirds here. In songbirds in particular, there's a real advantage to being an older bird. That, all things considered, females are typically going to choose an older male as opposed to a male that's just coming into reproductive capacity. We're going to start with this example of the Baltimore Oriole, which is appropriate for a baseball class. And this is a nice male. And the females are relatively drab, and that's often the case with birds. The females don't really have to be obvious, but the males do have to strut their stuff, and they often are brightly colored. So most of the time, female is going to be mating with a male that looks like this one here. So a male that was born last year, coming back into North America from its more southerly breeding or southerly wintering grounds, is going to be looking for a female, but in almost always it's going to be rebuffed, be either deterred by other males that are older, or perhaps the female herself will choose to take an older male. Here's what a second-year Oriole looks like. It has female-like plumage. So what this female-like male does is to skulk around the edges of a territorial adult male, an older male, and it will try to sneak in and copulate with a resident female before the other male even knows that it's around. And the male, of course, is not compelled to try to run this bird down because it thinks it's a female from a distance anyway. So this particular phenomenon is called delayed plumage maturation, that it takes 3 years for a male to come into its full breeding plumage, like you would see with that Baltimore Oriole that we began with. The same sort of thing happens in red-winged blackbirds. This is actually a male red-winged blackbird in its second year of life. Red-winged blackbirds are interesting in that they are polygynous, Polygynous. So polygynous just means many females. So one adult male may in fact have 4, 5, even 10 females that it mates with. And of course, since male and females are roughly equal in number in a population, that means that there are a lot of males out there that don't have any mate at all. So delayed plumage maturation goes on in red-winged blackbirds as well. So here we see a second-year male that would have little chance of getting a territory on its own. And this is what a female looks like, and you can see that they're very similar. So again, it's the same trick. Here's the male red-winged blackbird. So the male red-winged blackbird is commanding its territory with 5, 6, 7, 10 females on it. And what's going to happen is one of these young males will sneak in, and the adult male is thinking, oh, maybe I can get an extra female on my territory. But in fact, what that second-year male is doing is trying to come in and copulate with some of the females that are mated to this resident male. And we can have one more example in that this happens to be a warbler. It's called American redstart, and that's the male there. This is a second-year male, very different in coloration from the adult male, but it looks a whole lot like the female. So again, the American redstart is trying to deceive a resident male by looking like a female, hoping it can sneak into the territory and have a quick mating with the resident female. And by the way, mating in birds doesn't take very long at all. It takes about a second. So it's a very quick sort of activity. We're going to look at another example here of female mimicry. We're looking at some lizards that are called flat lizards. You can see, in fact, that they are almost two-dimensional. If we look on the left side in the lizards labeled I, we actually don't know whether they are females from this distance or what are called she-males. She-males are lizards of this particular species that look a whole lot like a female. In the lower left, in the three eyes there, you have two females for sure, and then number 2 in the left there, that's a male. That's a typical adult male for sure. So the she-males look a whole lot like the adult females. So again, what they are trying to do is to sneak in and mate with the females without being run off by the highly territorial males, which have the bright color. There are two ways that one could potentially distinguish a male from a female. One is visually and one is chemically. And it turns out that the she-males can't be distinguished visually by the typical males, that the males are going to be fooled by their eyes every time. But it turns out that there is a chemical difference put out by the males versus females. So if a territorial adult lizard, brightly colored lizard, gets close enough to a she-male, it can tell that it's in fact a male by particular chemicals that it produces. So the she-males keep their distance, and they're similar enough to get close visually, but they never allow themselves to get really too close to one of these brightly colored males, because then they would be run off from a territory and lose a chance to mate. We're going to talk a little bit now about a phenomenon that's called brood parasitism, and we'll start with cliff swallows. Cliff swallows are colonially nesting birds. You may have as many as 1,000 or more of these birds nesting on a cliff face or in these times on the underside of a highway bridge. So each of the pairs builds a mud nest, and they're very close to each other. And what females will do is to sneak into an adjacent pair's nest and lay an extra egg. So what they're doing is tricking another couple to raise one of their own young. So the couple, if they get fooled, then they are raising young that aren't, at least one young that isn't even related to them at all. So that's another kind of deception, and again we call it brood parasitism. In the case of cliff swallows, it's said to be facultative, which is to say that it's not obligate. It doesn't have to happen, that cliff swallows are perfectly able to raise young on their own, but they try to do a little bit better by inducing an unwitting couple in the colony to raise one or more of their own young as well. But there are other brood parasites that are said to be obligate brood parasites. They are incapable of raising young on their own. They have to rely on trickery and deception to lay eggs in other birds' nests and then to cause those birds to accept their egg and the chick that hatches out from it and feed that instead of their own chicks or in addition to their own chicks. So the common cuckoo is one example found all throughout Europe and Asia. And they lay what we call mimetic eggs. So different cuckoos will lay different colored eggs. So you can see the egg on the left in each of these pairs is the egg of the host, and the egg on the right, a little bit bigger, is the cuckoo egg. So they look very similar. So when a cuckoo furtively sneaks in to lay an egg into a potential host nest, it does it very quickly. Just a couple of seconds or so is enough. And with the exception of maybe a slight size difference, it's very hard to tell a bird's egg from a cuckoo egg. So many times host parents will take on the cuckoo. And when they do so, it usually means that they are going to have total nest failure for their own. Because here a cuckoo is going to hatch out a little bit earlier. Remember, the egg is a little bit larger, so it's going to hatch out a little bit earlier. And then the first thing it does, even though it can't even see at this point, has no feathers, it's going to push out the eggs of the host parents. So what is going to happen is the foster parents, essentially, are going to be raising a cuckoo. And the cuckoo is much larger than the host parents in most cases. So here you see an example of a cuckoo chick that's being fed by a small warbler. And the poor parents have to work so hard to try to feed that one cuckoo. And of course, they're raising a cuckoo, and they're not raising any individuals of their own species. Sometimes the tide gets turned, and this is a bird called a Sardinian Warbler, and a pair of Sardinian Warblers was parasitized by a cuckoo, so they were spending all their time raising a single cuckoo chick. And the cuckoo chick got so hungry that one of the parents was trying to bring it food, and instead of just taking the food from the parent, it actually swallowed the parent as well. And the parent got stuck in its throat, and the cuckoo died from asphyxiation. So of course the parent died as well. There are other brood parasites. Actually, this phenomenon of brood parasitism has evolved at least 8 different times in birds. And another example is this bird called the Honeyguide. The Honeyguide has an interesting mutualism with the honey badger. Well, the Honeyguide is very fond of honey, but it can't get into and of bees, but it can't get into a beehive. So what it does is to rely on the honey badger to do that for it. So the honey badger is after the honey as well. So what the Honeyguide will do is to locate a beehive, and then it whistles, gives a particular whistle that the honey badger responds to. The honey badger comes and rips open the beehive, and both the honey badger and the Honeyguide have a nice meal. But it turns out the Honeyguide is a brood parasite, and here we see one of the Honeyguide chicks. So the eggs was laid in some other bird's nest, and you can see that it has a wicked bill. And again, even before it can see, what it's going to do is to kill its nest mates by biting them. So it's going to be the only chick that's raised in that particular nest. This is a bird called the shiny cowbird, which was native to South America, but it has been spreading north into the Caribbean, and it's now in North America and southern parts of the United States. But it turns out that it's had devastating effects in the Caribbean, because the birds in the Caribbean had no experience evolutionarily with brood parasites, and so they get very easily fooled. And so this particular bird here, the yellow-shouldered blackbird, is now threatened because the shiny cowbirds have immigrated into the Caribbean islands, and now yellow-shouldered blackbirds are raising mostly shiny cowbirds, which of course are duping the yellow-shouldered blackbirds into raising their shiny cowbird chicks as their own. Another example here in North America is Kirtland's Warbler, a warbler found only in jack pine forest, mostly in lower peninsula Michigan, from the Grayling area in Michigan. At one point, the Kirtland's warblers were down to about 200 pairs, so it was in great peril. And the reason for that is that a bird called the brown-headed cowbird was moving eastward. And again, like the yellow-shouldered blackbirds in the Caribbean, the Kirtland's warbler had no experience with these brood parasite brown-headed cowbirds. The brown-headed cowbirds historically were following bison around in the far west, but as we cut down forest in the east and replaced them with cow pastures, the cowbirds have moved eastward. So Kirtland's warblers were mostly raising cowbirds. Then what the U.S. Forest Service started doing was to start trapping cowbirds, and so now the population has rebounded. There are over 1,000 birds, which is hopeful, but that's still a long way to go. We'll talk a little bit about this bird called the European magpie, and it is parasitized by cuckoos in Europe. And interestingly, the cuckoo here, it will destroy the magpie's eggs. So essentially, the magpie has to pay insurance for being able to raise its own young, or at least trying to raise its own young, with a cuckoo alongside. So what the cuckoo is going to do is to destroy the magpie's nest if the magpie ejects the cuckoo egg. This particular phenomenon has been termed the mafia effect. So essentially, the cuckoo is demanding insurance from the magpie that it's okay if it wants to raise one or two magpies, but it's got to raise a cuckoo. Otherwise, it's not going to raise any young at all. This mafia effect has also been, there's the brown-headed cowbird, by the way. The female brown-headed cowbirds parasitize, among other birds, the Prothonotary Warbler, which is found very commonly throughout southeastern United States. And the mafia effect has been documented here as well. So if a Prothonotary Warbler recognizes a brown-headed cowbird egg and removes it from its nest, then the brown-headed cowbirds are close by, they're watching, and they will come in and destroy the Prothonotary Warbler's eggs. So they're being forced, the Prothonotary Warblers are being forced to accept a cowbird egg to raise along with their own. Green frogs are typical frogs in that males are attracting females by calling, and females are typically attracted to larger males. So larger males have an advantage. Well, smaller green frogs have a trick, and what they do is they give a lower call. They lower their voices, which makes them seem to be large. In fact, they may be very small, but they are deceiving the female into mating with them, and that's the way that they achieve some reproductive success, even if they are small. And lastly, I want to talk a little bit about vocal mimicry. So we're going to look here at a blue jay, and we're going to listen to a number of calls that the blue jay makes. And toward the end of this sound file, you'll hear a distinctive sound. It's a typical jay call. It's called a pump handle sound. So that's the sound of a red-shouldered hawk. So what that blue jay is doing is mimicking a red-shouldered hawk. Here is a red-shouldered hawk, and let's listen to the red-shouldered hawk. So what the blue jay is doing by mimicking the red-shouldered hawk is forcing other birds to flee. And so if it finds food and it doesn't want to share the food with other individuals, what it does is to mimic a red-shouldered hawk, and it forces the other birds to fly away. So it gets all the food for itself. Marsh Warbler is an incredible mimic. It's found in Europe, and one particular study was done in England. And in England, it can mimic 89 of the species that it co-occurs with in England. So 89 different species. It can do a dead-on rendition of their songs. They winter in Africa, and people have studied the same birds in Africa, and there they can mimic 133 species of African birds. So they're remarkable mimics. And again, the advantage would seem to be to cause other birds to believe that there are a whole lot of birds in a given place, and that's not a very good place for them to feed. So all the resources would be available to the Marsh Warbler. The Crested Lark is a mimic that's found in Western Europe. And an interesting story with the Crested Larks is that a Crested Lark was around a shepherd pasture, and the shepherd was using border collies. And the border collies had different whistles. He used a different whistle for each border collie to go left, go right for this particular dog or that particular dog. And it turns out the Crested Larks just learned the whistles that this shepherd was making, and so it really bollocksed up the poor dogs because they were responding to the calls of the Crested Lark instead of the calls of the shepherd. The burrowing owls are an interesting bird found out west. They do nest in the ground. They often will use old prairie dog burrows. And of course, along the ground, historically there were bison moving around, and nowadays there are cows. So you really don't want a cow or a bison stepping into your nest, into the ground. So what these birds do is they mimic the sound of a rattlesnake. So when a large ungulate of some sort gets close, then they rattle their sound that sounds like a rattling rattlesnake, and that causes the cow or the buffalo to go elsewhere. And our last example, we're going to do the Mockingbird, which is a wonderful mimic. They can mimic not only other species of birds, but they can also mimic mechanical noises like lawnmowers and car horns and things like that. But we're going to just listen to this northern mockingbird, and as we go through, I'll tell you the names of a few of the other birds that it's mimicking, but it's pretty remarkable. That's a downy woodpecker, eastern towhee. That's a blue jay we heard earlier. It's a white-breasted nuthatch. It's a different blue jay call. It's called a killdeer, type of shorebird. There's a red-shouldered hawk, mimicked by the mockingbird. The blue jay again. Likes blue jays here. It's a brown thrasher. So pretty remarkable mimic. And so again, the mockingbird is engaging what's sometimes called sham for profit. It's trying to fool birds into thinking there are a whole lot more birds around than there actually are there. So these are some of the examples of how cheating and deception and dishonesty work in the animal world. Essentially, every animal is out for itself, and whatever it can do to ensure its survival, to ensure its chance to reproduce, it's going to take.